Thank you everyone for coming this evening, and for joining us for our spring speaker series. I'm Emily Hess. I'm one of the co-founders of the Morin Academy and of the John Paul II Catholic Worker Farm in Kansas City, Missouri. Tonight we are joined by Eugene McCarraher, who will be speaking on the Enchantments of Mammon and Techne. But before Spencer here introduces tonight's speaker, I just wanted to say a few words about the Morin Academy for any of our newer attendees. The Morin Academy is an organization formed between friends that were interested in the intersections of social and political thought alongside religion, agriculture, and ecology. We're inspired by the life and thought of Peter Morin, who, alongside Dorothy Day, founded the Catholic Worker Movement to help form an ecumenical, unpopular front, comprising everyone from secular humanists to Catholics. We're united to various degrees by our interests in classical political theory, Catholic social teaching, psychology, Marxian critiques of political economy, organic farming, and permaculture. We center these interests around Morin's tripartite platform of cult, meaning theology and liturgy, culture, meaning the arts and sciences, and cultivation, meaning farming and ecology. We contend that society suffers a deep crisis of meaning, and we adopt a thoroughgoing critique of capitalism and liberal modernity. We have a paramount concern for climate change and the environmental impacts of agriculture. And because we believe all of these are not just spiritual and intellectual problems, but also material and practical, we support the John Paul II Catholic Worker Farm based in the middle of Kansas City, Missouri. And to this end, we're hosting tonight's discussion and many more like this coming up this spring and summer. For example, Lori Johnson will be offering a course this summer on Aristotle's virtue ethics, and she's got a monthly Great Books lecture going on right now, which will be The Brothers Karamazov, is the one she's covering currently. Deacon Christopher May, who's also here with us tonight, will be offering a series this summer on Ivan Illich. Harry Murray will be back for another session discussing French personalism, focusing mostly on Meunier and Maritain, as well as Gabriel Marcel, Jacques Ellul, and Nikolai Berdyaev. Jacob Honshu is hosting a discussion group on Horkheimer and Adorno's Dialectic of the Enlightenment, and the next session for that is next Wednesday, April 16th. We also host a monthly Communio reading group, both in person and at the John Paul II Catholic Worker Farm, live or on Zoom. And Spencer and Lori have several guests lined up for their upcoming podcast episodes of Dust Bowl Diatribes, which will cover topics such as neo-feudalism and accelerationism. You can find all of this information that I just said on our website and our latest newsletter. And if you like this talk that we're about to have tonight, we've got a lot more like this on our Patreon, so we definitely encourage you guys to sign up for that. And without further ado, let's introduce tonight's speaker.
Yeah, so thank you so much for coming on, Dr. Eugene McCarraher. He is a professor of humanities and history at Villanova University. He's a Catholic philosopher, literary critic, and historian of ideas. In addition to publishing articles in periodicals like Commonweal and The Nation, he's authored Christian Critics, Religion and the Impasse in Modern American Social Thought, and of course, The Enchantments of Mammon, How Capitalism Became the Religion of Modernity. And he's currently writing a book about automation, which we'll be hearing more about. So Eugene, thank you so much for taking the time and energy to talk with us today. And go ahead.
Okay, thank you. And thanks to everybody else for attending. It's an honor to be invited, and I'm flattered that you're all here. It's 8 o'clock here in Philly for me, so this is kind of late, for an aging guy like me. Anyway, what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to say a little bit about how I came to write The Enchantments of Mammon, and also how I came to be interested in the book that I'm writing now about automation. So I'm going to say a little bit about the concerns that have motivated each one, and say a little bit about each one of the books. I'm not going to go chapter by chapter, but that would take us probably all night. But I'll give what I hope is a nice compendium of what's in the Enchantments of Mammon and what I think is going to be in the book about automation, which I swear will not be 800 pages. I'm contractually obligated to keep it short this time. So I will. So I guess I'd start off by saying that if I had to give a description of all of my work as a scholar for the last 25 to 30 years, it's been that I think my work has been a project in Christian humanism, um, an effort to write about capitalism and about technology and about economics and culture in the light of Christian humanism, and hopefully not just in the light, but also to develop that tradition in the 21st century. And therefore, I take it as axiomatic, because I consider myself a Christian humanist, that human beings are the image and likeness of God, and that we desire, as I put it in the Enchantments of Mammon, we desire a sacramental way of being in the world. Now, my first book was a study, Christian Critics, was a study of liberal Protestant and Roman Catholic social thought and cultural criticism in the 20th century. So I guess on a minor scale, it was kind of like Enchantments. It's kind of a Cecil B. DeMille production. It's got hundreds of characters. With many, I think, overlapping interests. You wouldn't think that liberal Protestants and Roman Catholics would agree about a lot, but they did in the 20th century. I'm trying to pair up, say, for example, the Niebuhr brothers, of whom I think H. Richard is actually the most interesting. I think Reinhold is frankly kind of boring, and I sort of wish he would go away. I think that even a lot of 21st century intellectuals are far too enraptured by him, whereas I think Richard is actually the more interesting thinker. And what I did was try to put liberal Protestants in conversation with Catholics like Dorothy Day, like the Berrigan brothers, like John Ryan, and many others. Now, the Enchantments of Mammon came about. I started thinking about these issues in the late 90s while I was working on Christian Critics, to turn it from my dissertation into a book. And what I wanted to do after the publication of Christian Critics was to go from theology as a subject of historical inquiry to thinking about theology as a tool or a mode of historical inquiry. And one of the things that I wanted to avoid when I did this was to try to avoid what's sometimes known as providentialism in history. This seems, I think, to be, hope I don't offend anybody, this seems to be a Protestant affliction, a Protestant malady, this providentialism, where we're searching what is God doing in history. I don't know what God's doing in history. That's way over my pay grade. What I did decide is that a better way of trying to enlist theology is to ask what human beings are doing in history once you understand human beings theologically. So we can abandon the whole fruitless quest of trying to figure out what the Almighty is trying to do in history. But I do think that it's possible to illuminate what we're doing in history if we understand ourselves in the light of a certain kind of theological anthropology. That was sort of one set of issues that I was trying to think out to sort of answer the evangelical historian George Marsden's question of what would historical scholarship look like if it was informed by Christian theology. And I was just sort of dissatisfied with a lot of the answers I was getting. Well, we'd have to talk about the spiritual in history or something like this. All of that seemed to me rather ineffable and abstract, and just not very useful, frankly, and illuminating. So as I said, that's one set of issues that I was trying to work out. Another in the 90s was obviously what seemed to be the apparent triumph of global capitalism. What liberal intellectuals, or neoliberal intellectuals, as they came to be called globalization. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Marxism-Leninism seemed pretty much vanquished as a force in history. You might have redoubts in North Korea or Cuba or Albania, but when even China is starting to morph in the 90s into this hybrid of Communist Party basically guiding and steering an authoritarian form of capitalism, it seemed to me that Marxism-Leninism was pretty much extinct, at least as a political force. And so obviously what people like me on the left had to deal with was the fact that it looks like capitalism won. The bad guys won, and so what are we going to do about that? And the other thing that struck me in the 90s was the sheer ubiquity of business culture in the United States. Now, it's not, you're not saying anything very interesting when you say that America has always been a business civilization. I mean, in itself, that's not exactly news. What I think was new in the 90s was, as I said, just the sheer ubiquity of business culture, not just business, but business culture. When you started to see cable TV shows with stock streaming quotes on the bottom every minute, you start to wonder what the hell's going on here. I've never seen this when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, everything being a stock ticker. The ubiquity of advertising, the transformation of the entrepreneur into this kind of an idol, whereas in the 50s and 60s in capitalist culture, it had been the manager, right? The organization man had sort of been the ideal. Now it's finance guys. It's Michael Milken. It eventually becomes Bill Gates. It becomes Mark Zuckerberg, and God help us, Elon Musk. How is it that the entrepreneur makes this kind of comeback in the 90s as the iconic figure of capitalism? What also is rising in the 90s, of course, is what we've all come to know as neoliberalism, as a moral economy, not just as a political economy. But neoliberalism justifies itself in certain ways and holds up the market, not just as an idea, not just as a good way to produce and distribute commodities, but as a way of life. The market and the market self, what Philip Murawski has called the entrepreneurial self, becomes this moral ideal in the 90s and the 2000s. And, that's something I look at in the book when I, discuss figures like Ayn Rand and others whose books are still, for some reason, they're still bestsellers on Amazon. And the other thing that struck me, and this gets to what to the subject of the book per se, is what I started to notice is this new kind of religious or spiritual imagery that I was seeing in advertising in the late 90s. And I'll give you a couple of examples of this. I remember when I was at a American Historical Association meeting. I think this was in 1999, in fact. I'd had a long day. I was in my hotel room. I flicked on the television. I think I had a glass of Jameson's with me. So, the story might be a little off. But I'm looking at the television and I see this ad for an Infinity car. Okay. Now, the curious thing about this ad for the Infinity car is that you don't see the car. What you see is a dark, cloudy background, no music, and there's a bird, small bird, flying silently across the screen. And then you see one word, infinity. You never see the car, no information about the car. just the sort of setting of a mood. That's one example. Second example was a Microsoft ad that I remember seeing probably around the same time. Again, you don't see a computer, you don't see a laptop. What you see is an older Black woman sitting on a bench, being surrounded by multiracial group of children who are circling her in slow motion, singing very happily. And she has her hands out like this, like the goddess Kali. And I just remember thinking, what the hell has that got to do with selling a computer? Answer, everything. Because again, what one is trying to do here is create a certain kind of mood and a certain kind of emotional associations with computers. And I thought, wow, capitalism really is starting to enter the realm of the spiritual. We're no longer seeing the product. We're no longer seeing anything about the product. We're just getting a lot of mood. So this got me to thinking over time about Max Weber's notion of the disenchantment of the world. You know, it's one of the conventional assumptions among intellectuals in modernity that one of the defining features of modernity is disenchantment or secularization. You know, even if one is religious, the idea goes, we no longer believe that, you know, the world is inhabited by spirits or demons or ghouls or things that go bump in the night. In other words, we've all become sort of rationalized. And, you know, this is a notion that's shared by Marx as well. You know, in the Communist Manifesto, he talks about, you know, the ecstasy of religious fervor being drowned in the icy water of egotistical calculation. So, you know, we're all, again, Max Weber and Karl Marx share this notion that disenchantment is one of the features of our world. But then it seemed to me, is this true? Is this really true that we in fact inhabit a disenchanted universe? And so I started to think about Marx's notion of commodity fetishism. And now certainly Marx's understanding of fetishism is different somewhat from the sort of fetishism that, you know, we would think about. But it still seemed to me that Marx's notion of commodity fetishism carried with it some kind of an implication that perhaps commodities and commodity culture were more enchanted than we imagined. And so I just decided, look, maybe I should look at capitalist culture. And what I mean by that is not just advertising and marketing, but things like industrial design, economics itself, management theory, I started to think was very important. So I started to look at all these things, and what I discovered, first of all, was that economics really does have a certain kind of view of the world, which counts as metaphysics, which counts as ontology. You know, one of the things that I say to many of my students, and believe it or not, I do get a lot of business students in my classes at Villanova. One of the things I say to them is, you know, the first couple of days that you're in intro to economics, you're not in an economics class, you're in a philosophy class. And so, you know, what do you mean by that? Well, first of all, when you're told that the world is characterized by scarcity, that is an ontological assertion. I didn't know you guys, if any of you are aware of that, but you know, you're being taught philosophy. You know, you're being told that the world is a place of scarcity. That's number one. And number two, you are being taught what philosophers call anthropology as well, because you are told that human beings are, you know, rational utility maximizing monads, you know, who only seek, you know, their own self-interest, who only seek their own happiness. And I say to them, this is just not true. You know, I don't care whether you consider yourselves sinners or not. It's just not true. If you consult your own experience, this is not the way you act. This is not how you act with your friends, with your parents, with your siblings, with your boyfriends, your girlfriends. This is not how you act. So why do you tell yourselves all these horrible things about yourselves? That you're nothing but a bunch of self-interested monads. So it just dawned on me that economics is really just another form of theology and philosophy. I started reading a lot of management theory. Yeah, I did it so you don't have to. You're welcome. It's a really dullard genre. I swear to you. you know, it, you know, it's I don't know. It's a form. It became a form of masochism for me. I figured I'm putting myself through this pain, so that my readers won't have to. Management theory is a form of moral philosophy. And it's no accident that many of its originators were, guess what, philosophers. One of the great management gurus of the 20th century, Peter Drucker, uh, had a PhD in philosophy, from the University of Vienna. Um, Mary Parker Follett, who is one of the key figures in the creation of what we call human relations management theory, studied philosophy and literature in college. And as I say in the book, you get guys like Andrew Urey and Charles Babbage, who are filling their books of what are in effect management theory with all kinds of references to Aristotle and Christian theology and whatnot. So these guys didn't think that these genres were mutually exclusive. I started to look at advertising basically as a form of iconography. The idea that in advertising you're simply being told what a product is, you don't get it. Advertising is basically capitalism's response to the stained glass windows at Shard. You are being taught and you are being sold literally a way of life, as well as a cache of commodities as well. So I think that I came to write this book because I became convinced that enchantment was in fact still here. It had simply taken a different form, and that Weber and Marx basically just got this wrong about capitalism. And I also became interested in the way that money basically becomes this kind of moral and ontological arbiter of what's real. It doesn't just become a medium of exchange and a store of value. It actually decides what's real. And there's something that Marx writes this in one of his early writings in the 1844 manuscripts. It's often called The Power of Money in Bourgeois Society, where he says, if I have a vocation for study, but I have no money, I have no vocation for study. None. As a matter of the market, my vocation for study or my thirst or my hunger or whatever literally does not exist if I don't have money. But if I have money, all of a sudden it exists. Um, that's an ontological arbiter. And again, business students, when you introduce them to this, will tell you, oh yeah, that's effective demand. I mean, in other words, they have these concepts themselves in the business school, but they just don't realize what they are. So that's how I came to write the Enchantments of Mammon. I decided that this is how I think people should start writing about capitalism. And you don't need an arcane language to do so. I mean, I think this was one of the problems with a lot of Christian historians in the 90s. It was that they thought, well, if we have our own theory about how history works, then we need our own sort of vocabulary in the same way that, say, Marxists do or others. And it just seemed to me, no, you've got a pretty well ready-made vocabulary already. Just start using it. So there you go. Now, what I also wanted to do in this book was to trace a counter tradition, a counter lineage to that of capitalist enchantment. And that lineage, I eventually decided that I would call romantic, with a capital R. Um, Mainly because it seemed to me that I was very convinced by the argument of a prominent literary scholar, M.H. Abrams, uh, who who makes this argument in a book entitled Natural Supernaturalism. It's from the early 70s, I think. And Abrams makes this argument that one of the things that you have to understand about romanticism is that it is a sort of a modern form of the sacramental imagination of the Middle Ages. Now, he doesn't quite put it that way, but it seemed to me that that was the implication. That what a lot of romantic poets and novelists and thinkers were trying to do was preserve something of that Catholic sacramental imagination in what you might call some kind of quasi-Christian or post-Christian, or maybe even, when I get to somebody like Gerard Manley Hopkins, a kind of modern Christian idiom. And so what the book basically does is tell the story of capitalist enchantment and its counter alternative, romanticism. So when reviewers said, basically you've got two, possibly three books in this book, they're not wrong. I guess I could have broken this up into two or three books, but I just decided not to. It seemed to me that sort of putting them against each other, pitting them against each other in a way, was was the right thing to do. So basically, I trace the development of capitalist enchantment from its inception in the Protestant Reformation. I do think that Max Weber gets that right, substantially in the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. And I trace it through developments like what was called the Christian political economy of the late 19th or the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Figures like Thomas Malthus, Thomas Chalmers, all of whom I think bear responsibility for atrocities like the Irish famine, and why it was so horrible. I look at the whole history of management theory from Andrew Urey, who I'm going to be talking about a little bit later in connection with automation. Andrew Urey and Charles Babbage, all the way through Peter Drucker, and more recent forms of management theory in the 60s and 70s. Now, when you get to the United States, it gets that's just in Europe is where the book starts, and eventually I cross the pond and deal with our friends, the Calvinists, the Puritans in New England, who I think really are villains. American historiography has gone through phases about the Puritans. V.L. Parrington in the 20s thought they were horrible, and then Perry Miller comes along and thought, no, they're heroes, they're really wonderful, and all this. I don't think so. I'm sort of back to V.L. Parrington. The Puritans were terrible. They were awful, and they come in for a drubbing in this book, as do the evangelicals. Any of you who've read my book know that the evangelicals come in for a real beating, and evangelical historians have gotten on my back about this. They're wrong. I think that I think the evangelical political economy is thoroughly, thoroughly a form of capitalist enchantment, as is Mormonism. One of the most fascinating things for me to learn when I was researching this book was the early history of Mormonism, and just how gilded early Mormonism was. If you think Mormonism is represented by Mitt Romney, man, you don't get it. You ought to go back and read Brigham Young and some of the earlier Mormon writers, and especially the Book of Mormon itself. Early Mormon theology and religious culture is steeped literally in gold. The belief that the earliest God was in fact a man, who was an accumulator of gold. It's just a fascinating early religion, and it is thoroughly, thoroughly bound up with capital accumulation and goods accumulation. It's shocking, really. And I think, but though I think though evangelicalism and Mormonism do set the stage for figures like John Rockefeller, who the good Baptist capitalist who famously said that God gave me my money. Well, I guess if God gave you your money, nobody can take it away, right? And Andrew Carnegie and I even think the populists were basically capitalists at heart. There I'm going against, sort of a strain of historiography for the last 20 to 30 years, which has seen the populists as these, there was first a set of historians in the 50s represented by Richard Hofstadter, who thought that the populists were basically just a bunch of weed chewing hicks. This is, Hofstadter and the New York intellectuals thought that, anybody outside Manhattan was a weed chewing hick. But so then you got this historiography represented by people like Lawrence Goodwin and Christopher Lasch, who was one of my heroes, when I was coming up, who were saying, no, the populists were anti-modern, the populists were wonderful, the populists were. I'm not buying it. I think the populists really at heart were capitalists, and capitalists who are better than John D. Rockefeller, but not still capitalists. Right. And, the rest of the book is taken up with the things like the machine age of the 30s. I look at figures like Henry Ford, like Walt Disney. If you like Disney, you're not going to like what I write about him in this book. Walt Disney not only was a union buster, he broke the cartoonist union in 1940, but sort of the stories he tells are basically about machine enchantment. I think that when you look at a film like Fantasia, for example, which on one level is a wonderful film, on another level, it's so thoroughly soaked in ideology that guys like me just can't look at it with fresh eyes anymore. This is what studying history does to you. And then what I think is really the corporate appropriation of Romanticism in the 1960s, by figures like eventually Steve Jobs, the conquest of cool, how it is that hippie culture and counterculture got absorbed by capitalist culture, where capitalism is cool now. Entrepreneurialism is cool. Disruption is cool. Upending people's lives through technology is cool. All that. But there's also a tradition of Romanticism that I think begins in 17th century England with Gerard Winstanley and the Diggers. It's represented by figures like John Ruskin, who I think is really kind of a moral and spiritual center for this book. The arts and crafts movement in both Britain and the United States at the turn of the 20th century, which I do think influenced figures like Dorothy Day and Lewis Mumford and other who are basically heroes of the book, all the way through to the 1960s and figures like Theodore Roszak. And whose making of the counterculture is still, I think, one of the best books, both about and by the 60s. So I end the Enchantments of Mammon on what I think is probably a note of hope, but not optimism. I finished the book, and I'd say the final draft right after the election of Donald Trump, and then I had to, I had to send it off, and I had to make a few changes. But basically, it was finished by the election of Donald Trump. So I do have a few things to say about him, at least in 2016. And yeah, so that's the Enchantments of Mammon. Now, the book that I'm writing now is about automation. And it's also somewhat about AI, as it's called, artificial intelligence. I was saying earlier that I think that AI and artificial intelligence is really just another form of automation. Some people try to make distinctions between these two things, but I don't really think there's much of a distinction to be made. Now, why did I get interested in automation? Part of it grew out of things that I think were unresolved in the Enchantments of Mammon. I was interested in figures like Andrew Urey and Charles Babbage and other 19th century British writers about manufacturing. Urey's book is entitled, in fact, The Philosophy of Manufactures, which again, I think is a curious title. And what it really is I think one of the first texts of management theory. And one of the things that Urey says very clearly in the philosophy of manufacturing is that automata, and that's a word he uses, automata in the factory, in other words, machines, are forms of control. They are ways to discipline labor. They are ways to discipline workers and keep them under control. So this suggested to me that mechanization or automation is at least as much about controlling people as much as it is about productivity and as much as it is about lowering costs, which is often the standard sort of argument that's given for mechanizing or automating. Well, we're going to cheapen goods and we're going to reduce the need for labor. Well, as I'll say in a few moments, I don't think the main fear for me about automation is the eradication of jobs. The main fear for me is the degradation of jobs and the degradation of labor by automation. Not so much its eradication. And what interested me about when I was looking at the history of automation was this repeated assertion, this repeated concern that automation is really political in nature. It's not just economic. There is a clear effort by people who are pushing automation to bring workers under control, to bring them under the thumb of management. And this is embodied in the design of the machines quite often. Probably one of the best books on this, if you're interested in this question, is David Noble's you would think, oh my God, I'm showing my dotage. The title, book by David Noble. It's a social history of automation. And what he's able to demonstrate is that post-World War II industrial designers and machine designers literally embodied the control of workers' motions into their devices, and that this was conscious. This was very deliberate. This was a way for management to assert control over labor. It also seemed to me that there were a lot of unresolved tensions in Marxist thought about automation. I know that you indicated that you're interested in Marxist critiques of political economy. Well, one of the things that I think is curious about Marx's writing about technology is how, I think, frankly, confused it is. Not just confusing, because I think Marx himself was confused on the question of technology. On the one hand, he definitely sees it as a form of capitalist control and discipline. This is clearly what he says in certain passages in Capital in the first volume. Yet at the same time, he sees mechanization as a force for liberation, as a force for emancipation of human beings from labor. So I'm trying to untangle this because Marx is so insistent on the centrality of labor to human flourishing and to human freedom, and yet at the same time he likes mechanization. He likes automation. So, but automation, it would seem to me, is the dehumanization of production, the literal dehumanization of production. So one of the things, that interested me in this question was, how do you resolve this? And I'm just more and more convinced that there's no resolving it, on Marxist terms. I think Marx is very confused about this. And I think later Marxists are. to be quite honest. Especially one figure who I talk about to some degree is Herbert Marcuse in the 1960s, writing about technology. There was also in the 2010s an increased amount of interest in automation on the left, especially around magazines like Jacobin and others, who were really, really enthusiastic about the prospect of robotics. And again, pushing this one Marxist line that you see in Capital and in the Grundrisse and other Marxist writings that automation will liberate human beings. And of course, there's the recent mania, and I do think it's mania about artificial intelligence, which a lot of what I'm reading about artificial intelligence strikes me, frankly, as hype. I'm not one of those who's convinced that, we're going to be able to create machines that can outthink us and control us. I think the one of the big fears is not for me that machines will control us, but that the designers of machines will control us. This is what I think. This to me is the real source of the fear. The other thing that bothers me about a lot of this AI talk is the way in which very intelligent people will surrender their agency, in the face of AI. One of the things that really depresses me about a lot of my fellow academics lately is the way in which we're all basically throwing up the white flag about chatbot GPT. Oh, well, you can't fight it, so we might as well, how can we use it and incorporate it? No, this is not how you should be thinking about this. It seems to me that this is a way, once again, of talking about technology in terms of inevitability. As soon as you accept the rhetoric of inevitability, it seems to me, you've given up your political agency. So, you might as well farm out your future to Silicon Valley, which it seems to me is what a lot of very intelligent people are doing lately. And I hope this book is kind of a salvo against that sort of thing. I don't know if I'd call myself a neo-Luddite. I don't think I'm quite there. But man, I'm getting there. When I look at that absolute freak, Elon Musk, and what he's been doing. The fact that guys like him who have the social skills of an 8-year-old, is actually, going to be deciding my future. I don't think so. Not if I have anything to do with it. Now, what I'm going to do in this book on automation, very briefly, is I have 4 chapters planned for this, not the 30-some, from Enchantments of Mammon. The first one is going to be something of a theological excursus on the fact that so what I want to do here is I want to take Lewis Mumford and basically make him theological. Now, I don't know how familiar, any of you might be with the work of Lewis Mumford, but I think he's a central figure in the 20th century study of technology and also of cities. And Mumford has this idea, which I think is still pretty useful, of what he calls the mega machine. And what he means by that is that, and I think this is the really brilliant dimension of his thinking, is that he argues mechanization of human beings takes place before the mechanization of their tools. So he locates the origins of the mega machine in places like ancient Egypt and Peru, where temples and palaces and irrigation systems would be built by these complex organizations of people. So I think, so what Mumford says is that the notion that you could regiment and mechanize people begins before the thought that you could mechanize tools and mechanize implements. And I think this is brilliant. But he also says that the origins of the mega machine lie in the desire of ancient kings and other despots to become godlike. And this is where I think theology comes in, because it does seem to me that there's a theological story to be told about technology. And I do think that it has to do with the idea that human beings desire to be godlike. Now, here's the twist on that. I think that if you take Christian theology seriously, and especially the notion of theosis, which I know that I guess is a notion that's more common in the Eastern Orthodox tradition than it is in the Roman Catholic tradition. The notion of theosis is that you do in fact become like God. That's at least part of what redemption is about. So it seems to me that the notion of human beings wanting to be godlike is not in itself a bad thing. Here's the catch, though. If you want to be godlike, everything then turns on what you think God is like. You know, if you think that God is a God of love, well, you're basically gonna want to be godlike in one way. If you think that God is basically power or will, you're going to want to be God in a different way. And that's why I think that the voluntarist turn in theology in around the 16th or the 17th centuries is really key here. Because when you get somebody like John Calvin, who really does think of God as will and agency before you think of God as love, then I think you're going to get a very different technology. And once you start thinking about God as love or God as power in the 16th or 17th centuries, my argument in that chapter is that eventually you're going to end up with transhumanism. So I do think that there's a line to be drawn from theological voluntarism to these insane sort of ideas that you get with people like Ray Kurzweil and others to basically turn human beings into mechanical prosthetics and to transcend the human condition altogether. I think it's behind, Elon Musk's desire to colonize Mars and other wacky ideas. I mean, to me, whether or not these ideas are practicable or not is not the point. Why do they have these ideas? What kinds of ideas are motivating our elite classes? We'd better start understanding these people if we want to understand what's happening. And so that, there's another chapter on, Marxist and socialist accounts of automation, capitalist accounts of automation. And I want to conclude with a chapter in which I'm trying to argue that you can, in fact, reconcile craft and artisanal conceptions of labor with a certain degree of automation and mechanization. That these two things are not necessarily mutually exclusive. But that the key here is that we give workers more control over their labor. Again, it seems to me that we have to reclaim agency in these struggles and debates rather than just let our futures be determined by, the Elon Musks of the world. So that's all I got. So I'm open for questions.